The topic is Dr. Martin Luther King at the 21st century, and of course the guest is Dr. Baldwin from Vanderbilt University. Dr. Baldwin, during this last segment, let's give you an opportunity to sort of inform our audience in terms of some of the things that you're thinking about in terms of Dr. Martin Luther King and how Dr. King, the role that Dr. King has played in what we're doing here today.
Okay. One of the things that disturbed me today is that we have this tremendous tendency to celebrate the dreamer, the person of Dr. King, who he was. But we don't want to celebrate and affirm and pursue the fulfillment of his dream.
Okay.
And I think that becomes very problematic for me. Not only is that a problem, there's also the problem of certain factions in our society trying to claim ownership to Dr. King's dream.
Very good.
I've heard people on the religious and political right use Dr. King in their efforts to promote what they call a pro-life culture, that is against abortion. I've heard people on the religious right use Dr. King against the gay rights movement. They are trying to use Dr. King to promote conservative causes. But you never hear anything about race, you never hear anything about economics, you never hear anything about peace. So they have a very limited perspective on Dr. King. I think there's the need today to recapture a sense of who Dr. King was, what his dream was about, and the kinds of tactics and methods he employed in the pursuit of that dream and the fulfillment of that particular dream. So the problem today, I think, adds up to a distortion of what Dr. King was, what he was about. And in many cases, we are too prone to celebrate the dreamer without celebrating the dream.
You know, Dr. Baldwin, what we always try to do is to have our guests to say something that would be beneficial to the young people, because of course not only would it be beneficial to the young people but older people as well. But I think that you would admit that we're having a real problem in terms of dealing with our young people and having them to focus on some of the things that are important, etc. Certainly Dr. King would have some attitudes in reference to these pants, that we are way people dressing, etc., etc. And so why don't you speak, you know,
what would be his message today?
His message to young people today in terms of what they have to do.
I think one aspect of his message would be study hard. Dr. King was an intellectual. You may think of him as an activist, a civil rights leader. He was all of that, but he was also an intellectual who took the academic life very seriously. And in his own speeches and letters to students, he encouraged them to study hard. That's one thing he encouraged them to do. Secondly, to avoid too much obsession with materialistic values.
Very good.
Because our young people are concerned about materialism. The price of clothes, the price of our sneakers, expensive clothes, expensive jewelry, that kind of thing. Dr. King was not about that. He said that materialism shouldn't be very important in our lives. We all have things, we all want to own things, but spiritual values are much more important. Moral values are much more important. We have to learn how to live in relationship to our fellow men and women. We have to learn how to make contributions not to just the uplift of ourselves, but to the uplift of all people. And we need to think in terms of the other. Dr. King often said that the first law of life is not self-preservation, it's other preservation. Yeah, we think certainly in terms of our own self-preservation, but we have to also think of others. And I think that's very, very important. And I think if he was alive today, he would focus on the need for education, the need to avoid too much of an emphasis on materialism, and the need to embrace spiritual and moral values.
And what about violence? I mean, what would
violence? I think that his message would be violence is always immoral. And I think he would say that on an interpersonal level, violence is wrong. In intergroup relations, violence is wrong. And in international relations, violence is wrong. You can't create a culture of life and a culture of peace through violence and human destruction. I think that would be his message.
You know, Dr. Baldwin, Dr. King has had such a tremendous impact upon not only our generation, but upon other generations. And I think what you're indicating now is that that impact will probably continue on into the 21st century, primarily because there's something that Dr. King stood for. Is that what we're saying?
Yes, yes. We're saying that there is a certain timelessness about his teachings and about the kinds of issues he raised. Unfortunately, the extent to which he will continue to live in our culture will depend a lot on what we do in our churches and what we do in our schools.
Okay.
Unfortunately, little attention is given to Dr. King in our schools, and little attention is given to him in our churches. We wait until the third Monday in January of each year to celebrate him, when I think we should be talking about him throughout the year, because the principles he raised or the issues he dealt with what we should be about today in terms of making the quality of life better for people generally, not just for the rich, not just for those who have means and who have resources, but especially for what Dr. King called the least of these. And he constantly talked about the least of these.
Well, I think you mentioned the celebration of the national holiday. What can you say in reference to that celebration? Do you think that that there's been a lull in reference to what has to be done, and that there ought to be a greater interest in this as a national holiday? I mean, how do you see that?
I think it needs to be, we should not see it as simply a day off work, a day to have picnics, whatever you want, that kind of celebration. I think it's a time for us to get together in workshops and classrooms to talk about the issues that still divide us as a nation. Not merely race and economics and violence and human destruction, but also politics. The nation, as you well know, is very divided now, between what some call the red states and others call the blue states, between what some call conservatives and others call liberal. Unfortunately, we're a very divided nation, and Dr. King always said that we can't achieve much that way. We also need to look at these issues, church-state issues. There's a lot of debate about that going on, about the religious right transcending the boundaries that separate church and state. Dr. King spoke to all these issues. The politics that divide us, the economics that divide us, the race and ethnic boundaries that divide us. And I think he's relevant to all of these issues. So I think instead of holding parades and picnics and just having days off work, we need to devote that day to some type of service to other people, or learning about Dr. King, or learning about how we can address the problems that are a part of his unfinished crusade, because his crusade is still unfinished.
And so you think our young people can still play a real role in terms of Dr. King? They can deal with some of the issues that they have to deal with today, looking at his philosophy and whatnot. Is that what
yes. Violence in our schools has reached epidemic proportions, and I think students can learn from Dr. King. We need to stop looking at Dr. King as some type of gentle, passive figure. He was a radical.
Who had a dream, as he said, and I think that's what most people believe.
Yeah, he was a radical. He was a revolutionary for his times, and he's revolutionary for these times, because he was trying to show us a better and a different way of how to relate, how to say no to violence, how to say no to economic injustice, how to say no to racial injustice, how to say no to religious bigotry and intolerance, all of these problems. So I think he's quite relevant, and we need to stop seeing him as this kind, gentle preacher who led demonstrations and wouldn't fight back, and we need to begin to see him as a radical, prophetic figure who challenged us with a prophetic gospel. And I think we put him in the proper perspective when we do that.
But would it be correct to say, Dr. Baldwin, over the last minute that we have, that he was really assassinated, killed, because of his dream rather than anything else?
Exactly.
What he saw as the possibilities of what could happen, people believe that he ought to be killed because of that.
Yeah, because he was a threat. Had he been this kind, gentle, harmless figure that a lot of us like to project, then there would have been no need for him to be assassinated. He was assassinated because he was talking about a radical change, or radical changes in the society. And I think we need to understand that.
Well, Dr. Baldwin, we've got about 40 seconds before we end this show for today. And I just want to thank you for bringing by that excellent information, and in a real sense, updated information in reference to what we've been dealing with on Dr. Martin Luther King. Because
Appreciate it.
he still, as far as we're concerned, he still is one of those great figures of our century. He was great in the 20th century, and he will be undoubtedly great in the 21st century. And I would imagine that like Lincoln and Roosevelt and other individuals who will have a tremendous impact upon our society, he will always have that impact.
Yes.
And let me thank you, and let me encourage our audience to tune in again next week for another informative edition of Comments. Thank you, and good morning.